Welcome to the Faith and Feelings podcast. My name is Taylor Joy, and I'm passionate about helping you untangle and honor your emotions, authentically practice your faith, and integrate both into your everyday life so that you can experience the goodness and delight that comes from living in relationship with yourself, God, and others. Thank you for joining me. Let's get started. When someone says the word family, what comes to mind? The warmth of being known or the pain of neglect? The image of the family is so deeply imprinted onto us, pressed into our minds, hearts, and sense of who we are in the world. What do we do when our families are sources of pain or confusion, or worse, harm, neglect, or abuse? How do we process complicated childhoods when we no longer need the defenses we used, defenses that once protected us? In this episode, my friend Ashley joins me to share about a painful relationship with a parent. She puts words to the long-lasting impact that absent or abusive parenting can have on our relationships with ourselves and others. She also describes how our experiences of being fathered can distort our understanding of the fathering of God. Ashley sifts through these experiences with such wisdom, care, and surprising gentleness, inviting us into her own internal process of making sense of her childhood, naming how she's been wronged, and offering compassion to the younger versions of herself who ached to be safe, held, and loved. She bears witness to the costly pursuit of learning and unlearning ways of operating in the world that are no longer necessary, and of trying to live between the love you understood and the love that every child deserves. Listen in. Well, welcome back to Faith and Feelings, Ashley. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here with you.
So you are the first person who's been on Faith and Feelings twice. So yay!
I apologize to everybody who's disappointed.
Well, since we met about a year ago, I have learned so much from you and continue to learn so much about engaging the harder parts of our stories for healing, both in how you model this in your own life and in helping others. And I'm really, really grateful for your time today.
Thank you, Taylor. Yeah.
Well, we are wrapping up a series on the podcast called When Life Doesn't Make Sense. And I know, like all of us, there have been many seasons and experiences in your life so far that haven't made sense. But today, you've so graciously offered to tell us about a difficult relationship with a parent. So to get started, would you mind sharing about this experience and what it's been like for you?
Yeah. Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Taylor. I think I'm going to just try at a 30,000 feet level to kind of start describing the context. But I think a big piece and a hard piece to unpack for me in my life has been something that doesn't make a lot of sense is when a parent isn't good. Just fundamentally not healthy, not good. And what it feels like to wrestle with that, what it feels like to unpack some of those things. And so in the context of my childhood, I did not have a good relationship with my dad and often felt really uncomfortable and unsafe around him and would avoid contexts in which I had to be alone with him as much as I possibly could. But as a child, there are constraints where that's not possible. There were a lot of themes that came up in regards to this, but prevalent one was just the objectification of women, the way that he would talk about women, the way that he would sexualize women in general, but even that context throughout my childhood and how that developed. And after I moved out and was married, it came out that he was being very abusive, physically and sexually abusive. And He was arrested. There was a whole big thing, but without getting into kind of the details of that, for the sake of siblings who aren't able to share their voice here, I really didn't unpack and didn't realize how much the relationship that I had with him had impacted me, and I had the tendency to see the context of other people's pain in my family as bigger than my own. People who had directly experienced this more more integrally. I really stepped into more of a role of seeking to seek and help them in their context, their story. So I spent a lot of my life really thinking that I was the one who had come out unscathed, and that this didn't impact me. It impacted these other people whose trauma was bigger than mine, and I needed to engage and help them. And so there's a lot of context just in that like didn't make sense. Life not making sense, for sure. Yeah. And then I think the second layer of that has been difficult to unpack is that spiritual layer of that, because my dad was someone who his reputation was very important to him, and he was very good at making people see the version of him that he wanted them to see. And so, I mean, he was a youth group leader in our church. He was eventually an elder in our church. So there are a lot of layers of like the difficulty of unpacking something that is meant to look good that isn't and never was really good. So that's kind of the overarching dynamics of that relationship. And I think it was not until my 30s that I started to unpack, like, maybe there were some of these things that actually impacted me.
Yeah.
Which is a little bit hysterical to think about. And it can sound heroic to think about, like, oh, like I was just tending to and caring for other people in my family. And I really did care for them. I really did think that their pain was louder, their pain was more real, their trauma was more real. But the other part of that, the hidden part of that, was that I had a deep avoidance of engaging my own pain and my own hate or heartache in the situation. And so there was both like a blessing and a brokenness in my engagement of that.
Yeah. So you said that you were in your 30s when you started to realize the harm and the impact of this relationship. What were the circumstances around beginning to realize that for the first time?
Yeah, I think I had another really difficult experience of suffering that came up, and I had a hard time unpacking it. And it was unrelated, honestly, to my family of origin, really. And in the context of unpacking that, I was invited to examine my own family and my own story in a deeper way. And for the first time, being invited into that, I realized there was a lot there. And the thing is, so throughout my childhood, throughout my teenage years, I knew that there was something deeply wrong. And I ached for something more, like so much, just longing for something better, something more whole, something more good. But because I couldn't put words to what was wrong, and everybody else accepted this like outside shell of what things appeared to be, I had to conclude that what was wrong was just something that was wrong with me. And so it wasn't like there was no level of awareness. It was that I didn't have a framework to understand what was happening. And without that framework, like I just had this ache and this need that I was like, gosh, must be the neediest person in the world, that this is unsatisfying to me, that this isn't well. In reality, like my need was real to be fathered well, to be cared for. And the breadcrumbs that I was surviving on, they weren't enough. They weren't good, but they were made to look good or to look more full than they actually were. So
I'm just envisioning you in this moment of being invited to look at your story for the first time, and maybe this image of being in a dark room and the light is suddenly being turned on. What were you feeling and thinking as you began to see the truth of this story in a fuller way?
Yeah. It was very hard in the sense that to some extent, it's easier to take on the blame of those kind of pain and those kind of things. And so when it's just something wrong with you, like, then you can control it, then you can manage it, then you can like try and set it in a way that like it won't obstruct other relationships, or try and like when it's just like, oh, like this is actually a really harmful thing that was said, that was spoken, that was related to you continuously, and it had an impact on you, and it wasn't your fault. There is a goodness in that, but there's also like so much pain and so much grief, and having to recognize like the full state of that reality. And so there was like a wrestling of like an avoidance of the pain of realizing like what had been done to you, or how that had harmed you. And that like part that wants to be like, well, but maybe it was just me. Right. So there was a lot of wrestling. There was a lot of grief. And it was kind of like the tug of war back and forth, wanting to like recognize and name the truth and sit in the reality, but also like that pain being, especially when it's something that has been like continuously like pouring over your life, and you haven't looked at it for that many years. Like it's like, oh, that's a lot to look at. And so, very, very hard, but like also freeing when you actually let yourself into the grief. And also very freeing of shame too, when there's personal blame that's been taken on, or this idea that like it must be something wrong with you because everybody else is okay with this status quo situation. Yeah.
When you think about looking back on your story and seeing the impact in your own life of the absence of the fathering and mothering, or the fathering that God intended, what were some of the impacts that you began to see in your own life, or even maybe in the lives of people that you've worked with who have had similar experiences of fathering and mothering that haven't been what God intended?
Yeah. Yeah. There are a lot of relational impacts. There was the relational impact to myself, which I've already kind of like hinted at least in some regard, that like my idea of myself, my relationship with myself, was that, I was too much. I was too needy. I wanted too much from people. Like, that must be the context, and there's something wrong with me. So there's a lot of shame around myself, my identity. And then this isn't to all like fathering situations that are broken and filled with suffering, but with mine specifically too, because there was so much like sexualization of women and this idolization. Like, my dad would talk constantly about like the ideal woman, which I knew was not me. I knew was blonde haired, blue eyed, like the way that impacted me, the way that I absorbed like the idea that something was not well with me. I wasn't the ideal. I wasn't and then the just constant sexualization of women, and like unpacking the way that made me feel as a woman. Like, what do I have to offer? What am I supposed to be? So a lot of layers of complexity with self, but then also there's relationships with other people. And so, a blessing, but also a hard thing in the context of my life is that I had male coaches, track coaches, tennis coaches, a husband and wife at a local camp that I spent a lot of time at, that stepped in the gap, and they presented these beautiful pictures of what like fathering could be, what mentoring, what coaching, what that like could look like in a positive way. And those were really good things, but also like relationally, like it got kind of all jumbled up. Like one example that I would give for this is that like I would be 14 years old on the track bus and going to a meet that was like 2 hours away. And all of my friends are like in these little bubbles in these little groups talking together. And I can't explain why. All I want is to sit with the coach and have an hour of undivided time to talk about anything. And like trying to understand like what's wrong with me, like that I don't want to just be like everybody else just wants, like they're socializing, they're doing healthy, confident, good things. And I have like this sense of starvation where all I want is like to receive some of that goodness. And I'll put myself in a situation to be able to receive it if I can. But then I'll make sure that it's not too much, right? Like back out before it gets too much. And so like in the context of my relationships socially, like that was a big impact on me growing up. So relationship with self, relationship with others socially, and then relationship with God is a big one. This idea that I had of like, what is a father? What does that look like? What is that engagement? And something that I think is really hard for people to understand is how much your experience plays into your understanding of those things, right? Even just language, like the way we understand words. And an example that I use to kind of help people understand this is this idea of like, I can bring a word to you that I know and say like the word apple, and like you're thinking about that word and everybody else is thinking about that word. But if your personal experience has been that you have only ever tasted sour apples or bitter apples, like, and everybody else is like, apples are great. Apples are delicious. They're my favorite snack. They're wonderful. They're so sweet. You know, like the context of that is that I might be able to cognitively persuade you that apples are good, but without experiencing a good apple, there's a level of understanding you're just not going to have. It's a deficit that you're just going to have. And so for me in that context, that is very much the way it was with Father and the understanding of God. I was cognitively persuaded. I knew my Bible. God was good. I was cognitively persuaded of that, but I had no understanding of what that meant or what it would be like to experience that. And except for those breadcrumb glimpses that I got from like track coaches or ministry leaders. And those glimpses gave me little like parts of the picture, but they also caused more grief because it was like that 3 seconds held more goodness than 10 years with my own dad. And so that could be like really painful even to step into at times.
What did that grief process look like for you?
Yeah. So I had like this consistent ache that would like persevere throughout my life. And when I, in my 30s, then finally like started to unpack the situation a little bit more and recognize the grief and name what was real, the grief was overwhelming. It felt so intense because, like I said, it was this long-term thing that had been built up over a long time of like pushing that ache down because it must be just me, to finally realizing like, no, that ache is good. Like it's grief filled, but it's good because it means you're longing for the goodness that God intended for you to have. And the framework of family that God pictured when he created and designed family was good. And so to be able to step into the grief and to be able to name that ache was actually good, that it was more alive to my heart than the pressing down was, than the pushing away of those feelings. So yeah, it was hard. It was good. Yeah.
I keep thinking about all the complexity in your relationship with God that resulted from your father. Can you think of a story or a moment when you began to experience the fathering of God in a transformative way?
It's hard to narrow down one moment. I think what I would say is that I was experiencing that when I was younger, but because I couldn't name what was happening and I didn't have a framework, I couldn't fully receive it. And so one thing that I've been able to do now that I've like addressed and understood the situation more fully is go back and remember those moments and think about like, that was from God. Like he was showing me that part of his heart, that part of his care when I was 10, when I was 14, when I was like, to go back and like piecing together a puzzle almost, that like all of the pieces were there, but you couldn't fully absorb because you didn't understand the experience or what was happening in your family or in that context. And so I've been able to look back and see so many places where he was showing me his character. And it's such a blessing to see like all of those kind of stacked up across my life. And a recent one that comes to mind that has really just been a blessing is, so I lead story groups in the context of our church. And one of the unintended blessings of one of the recent story groups that I led is that there was a member in there who offered such just a beautiful spirit of like fathering and care and tenderness and desire to just demonstrate that. And it really came across in the context of the group. But even since coming out of the group, like seeing him and talking to him, and he knows a little bit about my story and I know now a little bit more about his, and having him be able to just give me a fatherly hug, like is such a blessing, like, and a gift that and I know it's from God because it's like, here's the irony of like me wanting to do this ministry, wanting to help other people. And then like the blessing of that coming back full circle to be a piece of God showing me his goodness through somebody else. And so even in the context of being able to receive like a fatherly hug from this man in church who's showing me and demonstrating what like good fathering looks like is really healing and redemptive. Because I think about it and like in the context of my story, in the context of my childhood, like if you think about like how many good, healthy, like fatherly hugs or shows of affection or joking and teasing or whatever that looks like in your family dynamic, in a healthy family dynamic, and to not have that for 30 years, 30 plus years, like, it's just very restoring to see and be engaged in a healthy way like that. And that's just a beautiful demonstration of how God redeems those things.
Yeah. I'm even thinking about that moment on the bus. And that moment even being an experience where God was showing you his heart.
Yeah. Yep. Not everybody receives those things, but even like I had a tennis coach who got me a tennis racket and like he knew what I was using wasn't going to work well for the season, like gave me a nice one to use, like, just like the healthy dynamic of caring and showing care, in a way that wasn't objectifying and wasn't off-putting, and, receiving that kindness was, it was very meaningful.
As a final question, I'm thinking about the person who is listening and maybe they've had similar experiences with a parent. What encouragement would you give to them, and or what first step would you encourage them to take?
Yeah. I think healing for those things and growing in awareness of those things happen in the context of the body of Christ. And they happen in the context of sharing with another and being offered good care with another person. And I think one really scary but meaningful step can be to find someone who is trusted, who is caring and tender, and share that story with them. Because the prevalent thing for us is that our normal is our normal, right? Like whatever we've experienced. And so we tend to like minimize or not quite see or put together the pieces of what was meant to be. And it's in the body of Christ with other believers, with other people who have other experiences, that we're able to name and see the truth of our experience and the truth of what has been true of our lives and what God actually longs for us to have, that fuller picture, that more whole picture. And so I think it's a crazy vulnerable step. It's a really hard thing to do, but to take just one fragment, one piece, and to test it with somebody and say, hey, this is something I've experienced. What do you see in this? Like, what is real? What is true? Because I have the blind spot of me, like it was my experience. And I think that's really meaningful. And I think also, I would just say, like, in the context of the church, I think we've sometimes gotten these like blurred perspectives of what it means to handle grief. I know you're passionate about like opening the doors to us understanding what it means to hold grief and hold suffering well in these contexts as well. And I think about, like, was it Peter who stepped out of the boat towards Jesus? Like that step of faith, like that, to share your story. That's what that feels like. I think like that you are no longer on the boat where you are like trusting this man-made like thing that keeps you safe in the storm. Like you are literally launching yourself into like Jesus, and in an unreal situation where it's like, yeah, this feels life-threatening. This feels deadly. Like there's waves. I'm walking on water. Like, what is happening right now? Like, this isn't real. And I think like that is the goodness of sharing your story, is that step of faith. And like Peter gets a bad rap because then like, you know, he like looks at the waves and he sees everything and he doubts and like he starts sinking and then he's like, Jesus, save me. And and I think he gets a bad rap because, and I think we've also kind of like put some misinterpretations around it, like these like things that I've heard of like, oh, well, he stopped looking at Jesus and he looked at the waves and that's what happened. And that's why it's like, Jesus doesn't say like, oh, you noticed you were walking on water with waves crashing around you and the wind. Like it says like you lost faith, you had little faith. And so I think I spent a lot of my life thinking that if I looked at the circumstances of my situation, if I like spent time looking at that reality, then that would mean that I didn't have faith anymore, right? Like I can't do that. I just look at Jesus, like put these blinders on and look at Jesus. But I think faith grows in those places where we actually see and know the fullness of the circumstances. Like, yes, there are waves, there's wind, it's crashing around me, it's scary, and Jesus is with me in it. Like he's here and he's sustaining me in it. And so I don't think that what takes us away from our faith is seeing those circumstances and recognizing them for what they are. I think it's when we forget that he's bigger than them and he's with us, like in it. He hasn't left us. He's still standing right there. He's like, Peter, I didn't move. I'm still here. I didn't move. I'm still here. Like, so that has been just something that I think is good to remind ourselves of, that we can recognize him and look at the reality of the situation.
Yeah. That's so beautiful. Thank you so much for this conversation, Ashley. I'm really grateful for you and for our time together today.
Thank you. I'm grateful for you too, and for this podcast. Absolutely.
For so many of us who have experienced complicated or chaotic childhoods, it can be devastating to untangle the trauma of our family stories, especially when we may never get the recognition of the pain that we endured or apologies that we are owed. So I want to end this episode by reading a blessing written by Kate Bowler. Here's a blessing for you when your family disappoints you. God, I am angry and hurt and so incredibly sad. The very people who are supposed to love me and know me best have let me down. I don't know if I'll be able to let this go or find a way forward. I'm losing my sense of home, and the reality of it all fills me with a kind of fear, however big, however small, that this pain always feels unforgivable. I know they're only human, really, I know, but their mistakes feel like they echo through me. They strike a painful chord that rings on, and I feel convinced all at once that I am not loved, not known, not safe. I feel small all over again. So bless me, God, when tears prick at my eyes and I feel lost to myself. Bring me home. Remind me of the places you've brought me, the person I've become, when I can feel your light and peace. Forgive them for me when I can't, and send some grace for this moment to keep my heart from breaking, or my temper from rising, or any sentence from starting with "you always." You remember me when I am a stranger to myself and an outsider at my own address. Make me a home. Thank you for joining me for today's episode. I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me on Instagram at Taylor Joy. If this conversation was helpful and you'd like more information about my other offerings to engage your story more deeply, check out my website, taylorjoymurray.co.